Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Sheriff Eldrick Hawksley had spent 17 years working timber country before he ever wore a badge. So when the call came through about a body on one of the old logging roads west of the mill, he knew the terrain would complicate everything. The Coast Range swallowed radio signals and turned 2-mile drives into hour-long crawls through mud ruts that could snap an axle if you misjudged the angle. October rain had been falling for 6 days straight, the kind that turned unpaved roads into rivers and made every hillside a potential slide zone. Deputy Merritt Kestrel met him at the turnoff from Highway 38, standing beside his cruiser with rain dripping off the brim of his hat, looking like he'd already had a long morning despite it being barely past 7. The body had been found by a logger heading out to check on equipment storage sites before the season's real downpours began. Kestrel explained this while they transferred into Hawksley's 4-wheel drive, the only vehicle with clearance enough to navigate what passed for roads in the deeper timber sections. The logger had called it in from a satellite phone, no cell service out here, and had agreed to wait at the scene, though he'd made it clear he had work to get to and didn't appreciate the delay. Hawksley appreciated the honesty, if nothing else. Most people who stumbled onto bodies spent the next few hours trying to pretend they'd never seen anything at all, and cooperation from witnesses in timber communities could be scarce when the sheriff's office started asking questions about who'd been where and why. The drive took 40 minutes of careful navigation through standing water and around washouts that had claimed chunks of roadbed during the previous night's downpour. The deeper they went into the forest, the darker it became, despite the morning hour, Douglas fir and western hemlock forming a canopy that filtered the gray daylight into something closer to dusk. Kestrel stayed quiet during the drive, reviewing his notes from the initial call. The deputy had been with the department for 3 years, long enough to know that cases in the backcountry rarely resolved cleanly, but young enough that he still filled his notebooks with detailed observations that might never matter to anyone. Hawksley had learned to value that kind of diligence even when it seemed excessive, because the alternative was deputies who stopped noticing details altogether and missed the one thing that might actually explain what happened. They found the logger waiting beside a massive Peterbilt truck parked at an angle across the road, positioned to block any vehicles that might try to pass. Boone Fairweather was in his early 50s, weathered in the way that outdoor work aged a man faster than any office job ever could, and he looked relieved to see the sheriff arrive despite his earlier complaints about delays. He led them 50 yards down a spur road that branched off toward a clear-cut section, pointing to where the body lay partially concealed beneath a tangle of slash and broken branches that had been pushed to the roadside during previous logging operations. The victim was male, mid-30s based on first impression, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt that had once been dark blue, but was now soaked black with rain and other fluids. Hawksley noted the positioning immediately, the way the body had been placed rather than fallen, arranged with a kind of care that suggested whoever left it here wanted it found eventually, but not immediately. County Coroner Ione Wicklow arrived 90 minutes later, her sedan struggling up the final grade despite Kestrel's radioed warnings about road conditions. She was a woman in her 60s who'd held the coroner position for 2 decades, running a small-town practice as a general physician while handling the county's modest death investigation needs. Wicklow approached the scene with the methodical patience of someone who'd learned not to rush examinations, just because everyone else was cold and wet and wanted to be somewhere else. She spent 20 minutes documenting the body's position and condition before allowing anyone to move it, taking photographs from multiple angles and making notes in a waterproof field book that she'd carried to dozens of similar scenes over the years. Hawksley watched her work and waited for her preliminary assessment, knowing better than to hurry someone whose findings might make the difference between a solvable case and a file that would gather dust for decades. The victim had been dead for at least 3 days, possibly longer depending on temperature variations and animal activity. Wicklow pointed out lividity patterns that suggested the body had been moved after death, confirming Hawksley's initial impression that this was a dump site, rather than the location where the actual death occurred. No identification in the pockets, no wallet or phone. Nothing that would make this easy. The hands showed signs of manual labor, calluses and old scars consistent with construction or forestry work, but the clothes were too generic to suggest any specific employer. Wicklow noted what appeared to be defensive wounds on the forearms, cuts that had partially healed before death occurred, suggesting the victim had been in some kind of altercation or accident days before whatever killed him actually happened. The cause of death wasn't immediately obvious from external examination, no gunshot wounds or obvious trauma to the head, which meant autopsy results would take time and even then might not provide clear answers. Hawksley directed Kestrel to begin photographing the surrounding area while they waited for the coroner's van to navigate the logging road. The deputy moved in expanding circles around the body, documenting tire tracks that were already dissolving in the rain, footprints that had become shapeless mud impressions, and the general disorder of a forest roadside that saw regular use by trucks and equipment. Fairweather stood by his Peterbilt, smoking cigarettes and checking his phone despite the lack of signal, clearly anxious to be released from witness duty. Hawksley approached him while Wicklow continued her examination, asking the standard questions about who had access to these roads and whether anything unusual had been happening in the area recently. The logger's answers were carefully neutral, the kind of responses that conveyed information without actually saying anything that might cause problems later. The logging roads in this section were maintained by 3 different timber companies who shared access agreements, Fairweather explained. Traffic was supposed to be limited to company vehicles and authorized contractors. But enforcement was minimal, and locals knew which gates had broken locks and which roads could be accessed from unmarked turnoffs. During active logging operations, there would be dozens of workers moving through the area daily, but this time of year most crews were focused on sites closer to the mills where weather was less likely to shut down operations. The road where the body was found hadn't seen regular use in weeks, maybe longer, which was probably why whoever dumped the victim here thought it would buy them time before discovery. Fairweather had only come out here because the company wanted inventory checks completed before the real winter weather arrived and made the backcountry completely impassable until spring. Hawksley asked whether Fairweather recognized the victim, watching the man's face carefully for any reaction that might suggest familiarity. The logger studied the body again, more closely this time, then shook his head with what appeared to be genuine uncertainty. The face was too damaged by decomposition and animal activity to make easy identification, and thousands of men in timber country wore the same kind of clothes and shared similar builds from years of physical labor. Without distinctive features or identifying marks, the victim could be anyone from any of the small communities scattered through the Coast Range, or he could be from somewhere else entirely, brought here because the isolation made disposal easier and discovery less likely. The coroner's van finally arrived, driven by Wicklow's assistant who'd had to chain up all 4 tires to make it through the worst sections of road. They loaded the body with efficient care, securing it for transport to the morgue where proper examination could be conducted under controlled conditions. Wicklow told Hawksley she'd have preliminary findings by tomorrow afternoon, but warned that identification might take significantly longer if the victim wasn't in any local databases and if no one came forward to report him missing. Dental records could help if they knew where to look, but that required having some idea of who the victim might be, which circled back to the fundamental problem of anonymous bodies in remote locations, where people often disappeared for reasons having nothing to do with crime. Hawksley and Kestrel spent another hour documenting the scene after the coroner departed, though both men knew the rain was destroying whatever evidence might have existed before they arrived. They collected samples of tire tracks using casting material that would probably produce useless results, bagged some scattered debris that might or might not be connected to the body, and photographed the area from enough angles that the case file would look thoroughly investigated even if it went nowhere. This was the reality of rural law enforcement that never made it into television shows. Hours of careful work that often produced nothing useful, investigations that stalled because resources were limited and witnesses were scarce, and the physical evidence had been washed away by weather or scattered by animals before anyone knew there was a crime to investigate. The drive back to town gave Hawksley time to think about the logistics of identifying the victim and determining where he'd actually been killed. Missing person reports would be the starting point, checking recent filings from surrounding counties and expanding the search if local inquiries produced nothing. The defensive wounds suggested the victim had been in trouble before he died, possibly involved in something that put him at odds with people who had access to isolated disposal sites. Timber country attracted men who wanted to disappear or who needed work that didn't ask too many questions about past history, and that transient population created challenges for investigators trying to establish timelines and connections. Someone could work a season in the woods and vanish without anyone thinking to report them missing, especially if they'd been drifting between jobs and living in temporary housing that left no clear trail. Back at the department, Hawksley started the administrative work that accompanied every death investigation, filling out initial reports and entering the case into the state database that tracked unidentified remains. He assigned Kestrel to begin calling timber companies and contractors operating in the Coast Range, asking whether any employees had failed to report for work recently or whether anyone had noticed crew members who'd suddenly stopped showing up. The deputy approached the task with his usual thorough attention to detail, creating spreadsheets to track which companies had been contacted and what information they'd provided. Most calls produced nothing useful. Personnel managers explaining that turnover was constant in seasonal work and that tracking every laborer who quit without notice would be a full-time job by itself. The preliminary autopsy results arrived late the following afternoon, confirming Hawksley's suspicion that this wouldn't be a straightforward case. Wicklow had determined that death resulted from internal bleeding caused by blunt force trauma to the torso, injuries consistent with being beaten or struck repeatedly by a heavy object. The defensive wounds on the arms had occurred roughly 48 hours before death, which suggested the victim had survived an initial altercation before succumbing to injuries sustained in a second, more severe attack. Toxicology results would take weeks, but preliminary examination found no obvious signs of drug or alcohol intoxication. The victim's teeth showed evidence of basic dental work, nothing distinctive enough to make identification easy, and fingerprints submitted to state and federal databases had produced no matches as of yet. Hawksley studied the autopsy photographs, trying to extract information from images that raised more questions than they answered. The beating had been sustained and deliberate, the kind of violence that suggested personal anger rather than simple robbery or chance encounter. Whoever killed this man had wanted him to suffer, had taken time to inflict damage that went beyond what was necessary to simply end a life. That spoke to motive rooted in relationship or betrayal, the kind of murder that often grew from disputes within closed communities where formal law enforcement was viewed as outside interference. Timber towns had their own methods of handling problems, informal systems of justice that predated official authority and persisted despite the presence of sheriffs and deputies who were supposed to maintain order. The first break in the case came 4 days after the body was discovered, when a woman from a town 60 miles south called to report that her brother had been missing for over a week. The description she provided matched the general characteristics of the victim, and she mentioned that her brother had been working for a timber outfit in the Coast Range before he stopped answering his phone. Hawksley arranged to meet with her the following day, bringing Wicklow's dental charts and hoping for a positive identification that would at least give them a name to attach to the investigation. The meeting was brief and grim, the woman confirming through tears that the dental records matched her brother's medical history and that she'd feared something like this when he disappeared without contact. Her brother's name had been Daniel, and he'd been working in the timber industry for 15 years, moving between companies and regions as work became available. He'd called her 2 weeks before his death, mentioning that he'd gotten involved in something that was making him nervous but refusing to provide details when she pressed for information. The conversation had ended with him promising to explain everything soon, but that call never came, and his phone had gone straight to voicemail when she tried to reach him in the following days. She'd initially assumed he was simply busy or had moved to a location without cell service, common enough in his line of work, but as days passed without contact, she'd become increasingly worried that something was wrong. Hawksley asked whether her brother had mentioned names of people he was working with or specific locations where his current job was taking him. She provided what little information she had, names of companies he'd worked for in the past, and descriptions of a few coworkers he'd mentioned in previous conversations. Most of it was too vague to be immediately useful, but Hawksley added everything to the case file and promised to keep her informed as the investigation progressed. The woman left looking exhausted and defeated, carrying the weight of knowing her brother had died badly, and that whoever killed him was still moving freely through the same communities where he'd worked and lived. With a name and employment history, Kestrel was able to narrow the investigation's focus to specific timber operations where the victim had been active in the weeks before his death. The most recent employer was a mid-sized logging company operating in the same general area where the body was found, and company records showed that the victim had been working there until about 10 days before his death, when he'd simply stopped showing up for shifts. The foreman claimed not to know why the victim had quit, suggesting he'd probably found better pay elsewhere or decided to move on for personal reasons. Hawksley noted the foreman's careful phrasing and the way he avoided eye contact while answering questions, the subtle tells of someone who knew more than he was willing to share with law enforcement. Deeper investigation revealed that the logging company had been experiencing labor disputes in the months before the victim's death. Conflicts over pay practices and working conditions that had created tensions between management and crew members. Several workers had quit or been fired under circumstances that the company declined to detail, and there were rumors of informal enforcement actions taken against employees who complained too loudly or threatened to report violations to state regulators. The timber industry had always operated with a degree of autonomy that made outside oversight difficult, and companies in remote areas could get away with practices that would draw immediate scrutiny in more accessible locations. Workers who needed jobs badly enough often accepted conditions they wouldn't tolerate elsewhere, and those who caused problems sometimes found themselves blacklisted from employment throughout the region. Hawksley began to suspect that the victim's death was connected to his involvement in these labor disputes, possibly as retaliation for threatening to expose company practices or for organizing other workers to demand better treatment. The defensive wounds from days before his death suggested he'd already been in conflict with someone, possibly warned to keep quiet or face consequences. The final beating that killed him could have been the result of ignoring those warnings, pushing forward with whatever action he'd been planning despite the risks. This kind of workplace violence was difficult to prosecute because witnesses were terrified of losing their own jobs or becoming targets themselves, and physical evidence was often destroyed or contaminated before investigators could secure the scene. The investigation stalled when every lead seemed to circle back to people who claimed not to know anything useful, or who suddenly became unavailable for questioning. Co-workers who'd been friendly with the victim developed convenient memory gaps when asked about his activities in the weeks before his death. Company managers cited privacy concerns and legal advice when asked to provide detailed employment records or access to internal communications. The few witnesses willing to talk did so only off the record, providing information that couldn't be used in court and that often contradicted other accounts in ways that made it impossible to establish a clear timeline of events. Hawksley spent weeks following threads that led nowhere, interviewing people who had no reason to help him and every reason to protect their own interests. The victim's sister called regularly for updates, and Hawksley had to tell her repeatedly that the investigation was ongoing, but had produced no arrests. He could hear the frustration in her voice, the disbelief that her brother's murder might never be solved simply because it happened in a place where people valued silence more than justice. She'd grown up in timber country and understood how these communities worked, but understanding didn't make it less painful to accept that her brother's death might be buried under the same kind of institutional indifference that had allowed the problems leading to his murder to persist in the first place. The case remained open but inactive, one of several unsolved homicides in Hawksley's jurisdiction that he continued to review whenever new information surfaced, but that had essentially reached dead ends through lack of evidence and witness cooperation. He knew the victim's name now, knew something about his life and work history, but he was no closer to identifying who had killed him or proving what had actually happened in the days leading up to his death. The logging road, where the body was found, had returned to its usual state of muddy neglect, used occasionally by trucks moving equipment but otherwise forgotten by everyone except the sheriff who'd spent hours there documenting a crime scene that had yielded almost nothing useful. Months after the initial discovery, Hawksley received an anonymous letter postmarked from a town 2 counties away. The letter was brief and carefully worded to avoid providing any identifying information about its author, but it contained details about the victim's death that hadn't been released to the public. According to the letter, the victim had been planning to report safety violations and illegal logging practices to state authorities, and he'd been killed by people connected to the timber company to prevent that information from becoming public. The beating had taken place in a maintenance shed on company property, and the body had been moved to the logging road afterward to make it appear the death had occurred elsewhere. Multiple people knew what had happened, the letter claimed, but no one would come forward because they'd seen what happened to people who caused problems for the company. The letter provided no names and no evidence that could be verified, but it aligned with what Hawksley had suspected from the beginning. He passed the information to the district attorney's office, knowing that without witnesses willing to testify or physical evidence connecting specific individuals to the crime, prosecution would be impossible. The DA agreed to review the case file but made it clear that anonymous letters weren't enough to bring charges, and that any attempt to pursue the investigation further would require something more substantial than unverifiable allegations. The conversation left Hawksley feeling the familiar frustration of knowing what had probably happened while being unable to prove it in ways that would satisfy legal standards. Winter storms made the backcountry roads impassable for weeks at a time, and the investigation entered a period of forced dormancy that matched the seasonal shutdown of logging operations throughout the Coast Range. Hawksley continued to receive occasional calls from the victim's sister, and he continued to tell her that the case remained open, but that no significant new developments had occurred. She'd stopped asking whether an arrest was likely, settling instead for the reassurance that someone was still thinking about her brother and still reviewing the evidence when time permitted. It was a small comfort, but probably the only one Hawksley could honestly offer given the realities of rural law enforcement and the limits of what could be accomplished without community cooperation. The logging company involved in the investigation merged with a larger timber corporation the following spring, and several key personnel from the original operation transferred to other regions or left the industry entirely. Hawksley tried to follow up with these individuals, but most refused to speak with him without legal representation, and their attorneys made it clear that no voluntary cooperation would be forthcoming. The window for solving the case had probably closed before Hawksley even knew there was a murder to investigate. The crucial evidence destroyed or hidden in the hours between the victim's death and the discovery of his body days later on a muddy logging road where rain had washed away whatever traces might have remained. 3 years after the initial investigation, Boone Fairweather stopped by the sheriff's office unannounced, asking to speak with Hawksley privately. They met in a small conference room with the door closed, and Fairweather explained that he was retiring from logging work and leaving the state, moving somewhere where the past didn't follow people quite so persistently. Before he left, he wanted to share something that had been bothering him since the day he found the body, information he'd been too frightened to mention at the time, but that he felt should be recorded somewhere even if it never led to prosecution. He'd recognized the victim that morning, despite claiming otherwise, had known him from previous jobs where they'd worked together. More importantly, he'd known why the man was killed, had heard rumors about planned retaliation after the victim threatened to expose systematic theft of timber from public lands through illegal road access and falsified harvest reports. Hawksley listened to Fairweather's account and asked why he'd waited 3 years to come forward with information that might have been crucial to the investigation. The logger's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. He'd had a family to support and a job to protect, and coming forward earlier would have meant losing both. He'd watched what happened to people who cooperated with law enforcement in cases involving timber companies, had seen them blacklisted from employment and driven out of communities where they'd lived for generations. The fear had been overwhelming at the time, and only now that he was leaving the region permanently did he feel safe enough to speak. Even now, he insisted that his statement be kept confidential and never used in ways that might identify him as the source of the information. The admission confirmed what Hawksley had suspected, but couldn't prove, that the victim's murder had been workplace retaliation carried out by people connected to the logging company. Fairweather provided names of individuals he believed were involved, though he admitted his knowledge was based on second-hand information rather than direct observation. He described the culture of silence that pervaded timber communities, the unwritten rules about not interfering in company business, and not talking to authorities about problems that should be handled internally. The victim had violated those rules by threatening to expose criminal activity, and he'd paid for that violation with his life. Others, who might have witnessed the murder or knew details about what happened, had remained silent out of the same fear that had kept Fairweather quiet for 3 years. After Fairweather left, Hawksley updated the case file with the new information, though he knew it would make little practical difference to the investigation's outcome. The individuals named by Fairweather had scattered to other jobs and other regions, and without physical evidence or witnesses willing to testify, there was no realistic path to prosecution. The victim's sister had stopped calling for updates, having apparently accepted that justice for her brother wasn't going to come through official channels. The file would remain open indefinitely, reviewed periodically when Hawksley had time, but effectively closed due to lack of actionable leads. The logging road where the body was discovered continued to be used occasionally by timber trucks accessing remote harvest sites, though most drivers probably had no idea that a man had died there and been left among the slash and mud like one more piece of forest debris. Hawksley drove past the turnoff sometimes when patrol routes took him through that section of the county, and he always thought about the victim lying in the rain while evidence washed away and people who knew what happened decided their own safety mattered more than speaking truth. It was a bitter reminder that not all crimes could be solved, that some killers would never face prosecution, and that the isolation and economic pressures of rural communities could create conditions where murder was simply absorbed into the landscape like everything else that didn't fit neat categories of right and wrong. The case file sat in a cabinet at the sheriff's office, one folder among many that documented unsolved crimes from years of rural law enforcement. Hawksley thought about it less frequently as time passed, though certain triggers would bring it back to mind. News reports about labor disputes in the timber industry, conversations with other sheriffs about the difficulties of investigating crimes in isolated areas, or simply driving past that turnoff on rainy mornings when the Coast Range looked as dark and impenetrable as the silence surrounding what had happened to a man whose only crime was threatening to tell the truth about illegal practices that everyone knew existed, but no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. Sheriff Luther Bainbridge had been running Harney County's law enforcement for 11 years, long enough to understand that vast empty spaces could hide problems as effectively as any locked door. When Maeve Nesmith reported her uncle missing from his ranch 40 miles southeast of Burns, Bainbridge's first thought was how many ways a man could disappear in the country where the nearest neighbor might be 10 miles away, and cell service was more myth than reality. The high desert stretched for hundreds of square miles in this part of Oregon, sagebrush and juniper giving way to alkali flats and dry lake beds that could swallow vehicles and people without leaving obvious traces. Deputy Thatcher Coulter had taken the initial report and done the preliminary fieldwork, driving out to the ranch to document the scene and interview the few people who might have information about when the missing man was last seen. Maeve Nesmith was in her early 40s, a woman who'd grown up on ranches and understood the rhythms of isolated rural life well enough to know when something was genuinely wrong versus when someone was simply out of contact for normal reasons. Her uncle had been living alone on the ranch for 15 years, running a modest cattle operation on land that had been in the family for 3 generations. He called her every Sunday evening without fail, a routine they'd maintained even during the harshest winter weather, when phone lines were the only connection to the outside world. When 2 consecutive Sundays passed without calls, and when her messages to his landline went unanswered, she'd driven out to check on him personally. The ranch house was locked, vehicles were parked in their usual spots, and there was no sign of forced entry or obvious disturbance, but her uncle was nowhere to be found. Bainbridge met with Nesmith at the sheriff's office to review what Coulter had documented during his initial investigation. The deputy had photographed the ranch property, noting that nothing appeared to be missing or disturbed in ways that would suggest robbery or violence. Livestock were still in their pastures, ranch equipment was secured properly, and the house showed no signs of hasty departure or struggle. The missing man's truck was in the garage. His wallet and identification were on the kitchen counter, and his medication was still in the bathroom cabinet with doses remaining that should have been taken days ago if he'd been following his usual schedule. Everything suggested that he'd simply stepped away from the property for some reason and hadn't returned, but that explanation made no sense given the man's careful habits and his isolated location miles from anywhere he might have walked. The missing man's name was Curtis, and according to Nesmith, he'd been increasingly concerned about boundary disputes with neighboring ranchers in the months before his disappearance. The high desert operated under a complex system of grazing rights and water access agreements that dated back generations, informal arrangements that worked smoothly until population pressure or economic stress began eroding the traditional understandings. Curtis had mentioned in recent phone calls that he'd been finding evidence of trespassing on his property, gates left open that he'd secured, vehicle tracks in areas where no one should have been driving. He'd attributed it initially to hunters who didn't respect property boundaries, but as the incidents continued, he'd become convinced that someone was deliberately testing his responses or trying to establish a claim to access they didn't legally possess. Bainbridge knew enough about ranching culture to understand that these boundary disputes could escalate into serious conflicts when people felt their livelihood or family legacy was being threatened. Water rights, especially, could trigger feuds that lasted decades, with families nursing grudges over creek access or spring water that became more valuable as drought conditions made reliable water sources increasingly precious. Curtis's ranch included several natural springs that fed into seasonal creeks, resources that neighbors might covet if their own water sources were failing. The sheriff asked Nesmith whether her uncle had filed any formal complaints about trespassing or boundary violations, and she explained that he'd been reluctant to involve law enforcement in what he considered ranch business that should be handled through direct conversation with neighbors. Deputy Coulter had already begun interviewing neighboring ranchers, asking whether anyone had seen Curtis in the days before his disappearance, or whether there had been any conflicts that might explain his absence. The responses had been uniformly unhelpful, ranchers claiming they minded their own business and had no knowledge of Curtis's whereabouts or activities. Several mentioned that Curtis had been standoffish in recent months, less willing to participate in the informal cooperation that helped isolated ranchers share equipment and labor during critical periods. One neighbor suggested that Curtis might have simply decided to leave the area without telling anyone, tired of the isolation and the constant struggle to maintain a viable cattle operation in marginal conditions where one bad year could wipe out a lifetime of work. Bainbridge didn't believe the voluntary departure theory, but he also knew that finding a missing person in Harney County's vast landscape would require resources the sheriff's department didn't have. Search and rescue teams could cover the immediate area around the ranch, looking for evidence that Curtis had suffered an accident while checking on livestock or maintaining infrastructure in remote sections of his property. But systematic searches of the entire county would take weeks or months, and even then would likely miss important areas where a body could remain hidden indefinitely. The high desert was unforgiving terrain for searches, with deep ravines, abandoned mine shafts, and countless hiding places where remains could decompose quickly in the dry heat without leaving traces visible from ground level. State Inspector Orson Gearhart arrived 3 days after Curtis was reported missing, dispatched by the Agriculture Department to investigate reports of illegal hunting activity that might be connected to the disappearance. Gearhart was a career wildlife officer in his 50s who'd worked enforcement throughout eastern Oregon and who understood the complex relationships between legal hunting, poaching, and the underground markets that traded in illegal game. He'd been tracking reports of organized poaching operations in Harney County, groups that were harvesting elk and mule deer for commercial sale to restaurants and specialty meat markets in violation of state wildlife laws. These operations required local knowledge and access to private land, which meant they often operated with at least tacit approval from property owners who received compensation for allowing hunting on their ranches. Gearhart explained to Bainbridge that his investigation had identified several ranches in the area that appeared to be allowing illegal hunting activity, though proving it required catching hunters in the act or documenting the commercial sale of illegally harvested game. Curtis's ranch had come up in the investigation as a possible location where poaching was occurring, based on reports from informants and patterns of wildlife population decline that suggested systematic harvesting beyond what legal hunting would account for. Gearhart had been planning to approach Curtis about cooperating with the investigation, possibly allowing surveillance on his property to catch the poaching operation in action. The disappearance complicated those plans and raised the possibility that Curtis had discovered the illegal activity on his own and confronted the people involved. The connection between Curtis's boundary concerns and potential poaching activity seemed obvious once Gearhart laid out his findings. The trespassing that Curtis had been noticing could have been poachers accessing his land to hunt illegally, using his springs and natural features to attract game, and then harvesting it for commercial sale. If Curtis had discovered this activity and threatened to report it to authorities, the poachers would have strong motivation to prevent him from following through on those threats. Poaching operations that supplied commercial markets often involved serious money and organized networks that wouldn't hesitate to use violence against anyone who threatened to expose their activities. Bainbridge and Gearhart began a joint investigation focusing on identifying who had been accessing Curtis's property and whether any of the suspected poaching operations had connections to neighboring ranches. The state inspector had been building case files on several individuals suspected of involvement in illegal game sales, including detailed surveillance logs and financial records that showed suspicious income patterns inconsistent with legitimate ranching or hunting guide services. Several of these suspects owned or leased property adjacent to Curtis's ranch, which would have given them convenient access to his land and resources. The challenge was connecting the poaching activity directly to Curtis's disappearance in ways that would justify search warrants or arrests without tipping off the suspects that they were under investigation. The breakthrough came when Gearhart's surveillance team documented a truck leaving one of the neighboring ranches in the early morning hours, driving cross-country rather than using established roads. The truck matched descriptions of vehicles that had been seen on Curtis's property in the weeks before his disappearance, and following it led investigators to a processing facility located in an industrial area near Burns, where game meat was being packaged for commercial distribution. The facility operators claimed they purchased all meat from licensed processors who harvested animals legally, but inspection of their records revealed discrepancies in volume and species that suggested they were handling illegal game along with legitimate products. Financial records showed payments to several individuals connected to the ranches surrounding Curtis's property, creating a paper trail that linked the commercial operation to the suspected poaching network. Armed with this evidence, Bainbridge obtained search warrants for several properties, including the ranch immediately adjacent to Curtis's land. The searches uncovered significant evidence of poaching activity, including illegal hunting equipment, processing supplies, and communication records that documented coordination between multiple participants in the commercial poaching operation. More importantly, investigators found maps of Curtis's property with hand-drawn notations marking spring locations, natural game corridors, and optimal hunting positions. The maps included notes about avoiding detection and schedule information that suggested the poachers had been monitoring Curtis's movements to determine when his property would be accessible without risk of discovery. What the searches didn't reveal was any direct evidence of what had happened to Curtis or where he might be located. The individuals arrested during the warrant execution all denied involvement in the disappearance, claiming they'd been using Curtis's property without permission but hadn't encountered him or had any conflicts that would explain his absence. Their attorneys quickly established that, while the poaching charges were serious, there was no proof connecting their clients to any violence or kidnapping. The district attorney's office began building cases for wildlife violations and conspiracy charges, but warned Bainbridge that without a body or witnesses willing to testify about Curtis's fate, murder charges would be difficult to pursue even if everyone suspected that the disappearance was connected to the poaching operation. Bainbridge expanded the search effort, focusing on areas of Curtis's property that would be accessible to the poachers and that offered concealment for disposing of evidence. Deputy Coulter coordinated with search and rescue teams to examine ravines, abandoned structures, and remote sections of rangeland where a body might have been hidden. The searches continued for weeks, teams covering hundreds of acres of rough terrain in temperatures that sometimes exceeded 90 degrees. They found evidence of the poaching activity, shell casings and gut piles that confirmed illegal hunting had been occurring, but no sign of Curtis. The high desert was revealing some of its secrets, but keeping others locked away beneath sagebrush and alkali soil that had absorbed countless histories without offering easy answers. Maeve Nesmith attended every search operation, walking alongside volunteers and professional rescue teams as they gridded sections of her uncle's property. Bainbridge watched her process the growing likelihood that Curtis was dead and that his body might never be recovered. She asked the questions that families always asked in these situations. How long would the searches continue? What would happen if they never found him? Whether there was anything more she could do to help. The sheriff provided what reassurances he could while being honest about the limitations of what law enforcement could accomplish in terrain this vast, with evidence this sparse. The legal aspects of declaring someone dead without a body would take years to resolve, and even then would provide no real closure for a family that wanted answers about what happened and why. The poaching investigation continued to expand as Gearhart and his team unraveled the full scope of the commercial operation. The network involved more than a dozen individuals operating across 3 counties, harvesting elk, mule deer, and pronghorn antelope for sale to buyers in California and Nevada. The operation had been running for at least 5 years, generating significant income for participants who had gradually grown bolder about accessing private property and taking larger harvests as demand for illegal game increased. Curtis's ranch had been particularly valuable to the operation because of its water sources and natural features that concentrated wildlife in predictable patterns, making hunting efficient and profitable. Interviews with lower-level participants in the poaching operation eventually produced information about Curtis's fate, though the accounts were second-hand and carefully worded to avoid direct admission of involvement in violence. According to these sources, Curtis had discovered the poaching activity approximately 2 weeks before his disappearance and had confronted one of the organizers about the trespassing and illegal hunting. The confrontation had been hostile, with Curtis threatening to contact both the sheriff and state wildlife authorities to report what he'd observed. The organizer had allegedly tried to buy Curtis's silence by offering him a share of the profits from the operation, but Curtis had refused and insisted that the poaching stop immediately and permanently. What happened next was described in vague terms that suggested murder without explicitly stating it. Curtis had allegedly been taken to a remote location off his property, somewhere in the extensive public land that surrounded private ranches in this part of the county. The accounts differed on exactly what happened, whether Curtis had been killed immediately or whether there'd been an extended period of intimidation and negotiation before violence occurred. What everyone seemed to agree on was that Curtis's body had been disposed of in a way that made recovery unlikely, possibly buried in a location that would be impossible to find without specific coordinates, or possibly disposed of in one of the many abandoned mine shafts that dotted the high desert landscape. Bainbridge tried to pressure the individuals providing this information to give more specific details about Curtis's location, but they claimed not to know the exact disposal site and insisted they'd only heard about the murder from others who had directly participated. The prosecutors explored offering reduced charges in exchange for cooperation, but the legal complexities of proving murder without a body made such deals risky. Defense attorneys argued that the stories about Curtis's fate were rumors and speculation rather than reliable testimony, and that their client's knowledge of poaching activity didn't prove involvement in any violent crime. The cases ground through preliminary hearings and plea negotiations while Bainbridge continued trying to find Curtis's remains. The investigation revealed other concerning patterns that suggested the poaching operation had been more violent and extensive than initially suspected. Several other ranchers in the region had experienced boundary disputes and trespassing issues similar to what Curtis had reported, and at least 2 of these individuals had left the area suddenly after selling their properties under circumstances that now seemed suspicious. Financial records showed that some of the ranch sales had involved buyers connected to the poaching network, suggesting a systematic effort to gain control of strategic properties that provided access to prime hunting grounds. The picture emerging was of a criminal organization that used violence and intimidation to eliminate obstacles while steadily expanding their territorial control under the cover of legitimate ranching operations. Gearhart's investigation eventually resulted in federal charges being filed against the leaders of the poaching operation, including conspiracy and racketeering counts that carried significant prison sentences. The federal prosecution had resources that the county-level investigation lacked, including the ability to offer witness protection and leverage financial crimes to pressure cooperation from participants who might otherwise remain silent. Several individuals accepted plea agreements that required them to provide detailed information about the organization's activities, and while these accounts confirmed that Curtis had been murdered, they still failed to provide specific information about where his remains could be found. The search for Curtis officially concluded after 6 months, though Bainbridge made it clear that the case remained open and that any new information would trigger renewed investigation. Maeve Nesmith began the legal process of having her uncle declared deceased, working with attorneys to navigate the complex requirements for death certificates when no body had been recovered. She eventually sold Curtis's ranch, unable to maintain the property alone and unwilling to continue living with the constant reminder of her uncle's unresolved disappearance. The new owners were a young couple from out of state, people with no connection to the area's history or awareness of what had happened on the land they were purchasing. Bainbridge drove past Curtis's ranch occasionally when patrol routes took him through that section of the county, and he always wondered whether the body was somewhere on that property, buried in a location that the extensive searches had somehow missed. The high desert kept its secrets well, and the sheriff had learned over years of rural law enforcement that not every missing person would be found, and not every crime would be solved to the satisfaction of families who deserved answers. The poaching operation had been dismantled, and its leaders were facing serious prison time. But Curtis remained missing, and the specific individuals responsible for his murder had likely escaped prosecution by maintaining silence and letting others take the blame for the organization's broader criminal activities. The case file grew thick with reports and evidence documentation, a record of the investigation's scope and the resources invested in trying to find Curtis and bring his killers to justice. Bainbridge reviewed it periodically, looking for angles that might have been missed or connections that could lead to new investigative directions. The file included dozens of photographs of Curtis's ranch, images that documented a life interrupted, and a property that had passed to new owners who would probably never know about the violence and betrayal that had unfolded in the same spaces where they were building their own futures. Years after Curtis's disappearance, Bainbridge received a call from a hiker who'd found human remains in a remote canyon approximately 30 miles from Curtis's ranch. The remains were badly decomposed and scattered by scavengers, but clothing fragments and a distinctive belt buckle suggested they might belong to the missing rancher. DNA testing eventually confirmed the identification, finally giving Maeve Nesmith the certainty she'd been seeking even though it came too late to provide real comfort. The location where Curtis was found made it clear that his killers had taken him far from his property before ending his life. Choosing a disposal site that had no connection to the poaching operation or the ranches where the murder was likely planned. The discovery of Curtis's remains didn't lead to new charges or arrests. The individuals already convicted of poaching-related offenses denied knowledge of the murder, and those who'd been released after serving sentences for lesser charges couldn't be retried for the same criminal conspiracy. The prosecutor's office reviewed whether new evidence could support additional charges, but without witnesses or physical evidence connecting specific individuals to Curtis's death, the legal obstacles remained insurmountable. The case was officially closed as a homicide with identified victim, but no prosecutable suspects, a resolution that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while providing no real justice for Curtis or his family. Bainbridge attended Curtis's funeral, a small service organized by Maeve Nesmith in the town where she'd grown up and where her uncle had lived for most of his life. The sheriff listened to memories shared by people who'd known Curtis as a neighbor, a rancher, and a man who'd tried to protect his property from people who saw isolated land as an opportunity for exploitation, rather than as someone's home and livelihood. The service was quiet and sparsely attended, reflecting Curtis's solitary life, but also the community's ongoing discomfort with a case that had revealed uncomfortable truths about how criminal operations could flourish in rural areas where isolation and economic pressure created conditions that allowed violence to remain hidden for years. The high desert landscape remained unchanged by Curtis's death and the investigation it triggered. Sagebrush and juniper continuing their slow growth across terrain that had witnessed human drama without recording it in any permanent way. Bainbridge drove the county's empty highways and imagined all the other stories that might be hidden in ravines and abandoned structures, the disappeared people and unresolved crimes that rural sheriffs carried in case files and memory. The job required accepting that some investigations would never reach satisfying conclusions, that evidence would be lost to weather and time, and that justice would sometimes be defined by whatever limited accountability could be achieved rather than by the complete resolution that families and communities deserved. Curtis's ranch continued under new ownership, the young couple unaware of the full history of the property they were working to restore and develop. Bainbridge wondered sometimes what they would think if they knew about the poaching operation that had used their land, about the murder that had occurred because someone tried to protect what was rightfully his. The sheriff had learned not to share these histories unless absolutely necessary, understanding that knowledge of past violence could poison present opportunities and that sometimes ignorance allowed people to build futures on ground that had absorbed tragedy without being defined by it. The high desert would keep its secrets, and Bainbridge would keep his files, and somewhere between those silences lived the truth about what happened when isolation and greed intersected with someone's determination to protect land that had been family legacy for generations. Sheriff Cairn Whitlow had worked accident investigations throughout the Columbia Gorge for 9 years before he started noticing the pattern, which bothered him more than the pattern itself because it meant he'd been looking at something suspicious without recognizing it for far longer than should have been acceptable. The gorge was notorious for traffic incidents, narrow highways carved into cliff faces where one wrong move could send a vehicle tumbling hundreds of feet into the Columbia River, or into rocky ravines that turned accidents into fatalities more often than anywhere else in the state. Deputy Perrin Aldridge had brought the concern to Whitlow's attention after reviewing 5 years of accident reports and finding a cluster of incidents that shared unusual characteristics, similarities that seemed too consistent to be coincidence, but too subtle to have triggered immediate investigation when each case was examined individually. The accidents all involved single vehicles leaving the roadway in locations where there were no obvious explanations for why experienced drivers would lose control. No adverse weather conditions at the time of the incidents, no mechanical failures documented in vehicle inspections, and no evidence that the drivers had been impaired by drugs or alcohol when the crashes occurred. What made the pattern more troubling was that in each case, the vehicles had been recovered by the same tow service operating out of Hood River, a company owned by a man named Silas Coldiron, who'd held the contract for accident recovery along that section of Highway 14 for more than a decade. Aldridge had flagged this detail because it seemed unlikely that one tow operator would respond to so many fatal accidents in remote locations unless there was some reason those particular crashes were being routed to his service rather than being handled by closer companies or state police recovery teams. Whitlow reviewed the case files himself, looking for the details that Aldridge had identified as suspicious. The accidents had occurred over a span of 3 years, spread out enough that no one had considered them as related incidents. Each crash had resulted in the vehicle rolling down steep embankments or plunging into areas where recovery was difficult and dangerous, requiring specialized equipment and expertise that justified calling in cold iron's operation rather than attempting recovery with standard tow trucks. The drivers in 3 of the cases had been killed in the crashes, while 2 others had survived with serious injuries, but had provided vague or inconsistent accounts of what caused them to lose control. The survivors had both mentioned seeing another vehicle on the road just before their accidents, though neither could provide detailed descriptions, and both had eventually attributed their crashes to their own errors in judgment or momentary inattention. The financial aspect of the pattern became clear when Whitlow examined insurance claims and payment records associated with the accidents. Cold Iron's towing service had billed substantial fees for each recovery, amounts that seemed high, even accounting for the difficult terrain and equipment requirements. More significantly, several of the recovered vehicles had been declared total losses and sold for salvage at prices well below their actual value, with Cold Iron's company handling the salvage sales and taking unusually large commissions for their role in the transactions. The pattern suggested that someone was profiting from these accidents beyond the legitimate fees for towing and recovery services, possibly staging crashes that would result in profitable salvage operations while creating plausible cover stories that would prevent serious investigation. Aldridge had also identified a troubling connection between some of the accident victims and a widow named Wren Bellwether, who'd lost her husband in one of the crashes 3 years earlier. Bellwether had been suspicious about her husband's accident from the beginning, questioning why an experienced driver familiar with gorge roads would lose control in good conditions on a stretch of highway he'd driven hundreds of times before. She'd hired a private investigator to examine the crash site and vehicle, and that investigation had identified what appeared to be evidence that the guardrail where her husband's vehicle left the roadway had been deliberately compromised. Metal had been cut and repositioned to make the guardrail appear intact, while actually providing no resistance when the vehicle struck it, ensuring that the crash would result in the car leaving the roadway completely, rather than being stopped or slowed by the safety barrier. The private investigator's findings had been reported to state police, but the investigation had gone nowhere because by the time the evidence was examined, the damaged guardrail section had been replaced during routine maintenance, and the original materials had been discarded. Without physical evidence to support claims of tampering, and with the victim's widow being the only person pushing for further investigation, the case had been closed as a tragic accident with no criminal element. Bellwether had remained convinced that her husband was murdered, but her efforts to reopen the investigation had been unsuccessful, and she'd eventually been advised by law enforcement officials to accept the accident determination and move forward with her life rather than pursuing conspiracy theories that had no evidentiary support. Whitlow decided to approach Bellwether directly, rather than relying solely on the case files and official reports. They met at a coffee shop in Hood River, away from the sheriff's office where the conversation might draw attention from people who'd dismissed her concerns for years. Bellwether was in her late 30s, composed and precise in her presentation of evidence she'd been collecting since her husband's death. She'd created detailed timelines and maps, documented inconsistencies in the accident investigation, and compiled information about the other crashes that had occurred in similar circumstances along the same section of Highway 14. She'd been trying to convince someone in law enforcement to take her seriously for 3 years, and Whitlow could see the mixture of hope and skepticism on her face as she walked him through her research. Her husband had worked for a technology company in Portland, commuting regularly through the gorge and frequently stopping at small towns along the route to meet with clients or conduct business. In the weeks before his death, he'd mentioned to Bellwether that he'd witnessed what appeared to be an insurance fraud scheme involving staged accidents and exaggerated injury claims. He'd been considering whether to report what he'd observed to authorities, concerned that his silence might make him complicit in illegal activity, but also worried that getting involved would create problems with his job and expose him to retaliation from whoever was running the fraud operation. According to Bellwether, her husband had been planning to contact the state insurance fraud division the week after his accident occurred. Timing that seemed too coincidental to be random chance. The insurance fraud angle provided a new framework for understanding the accident pattern that Aldridge had identified. If someone was staging crashes to generate fraudulent insurance claims while also profiting from vehicle salvage operations, they would need control over multiple aspects of the accident response and investigation process. Having a tow service that could ensure evidence was handled in ways that prevented close examination would be crucial, as would having relationships with local officials who could influence whether accidents received thorough investigation or were processed as routine incidents. The gorge's isolation and the frequency of legitimate accidents would provide perfect cover for a fraud operation, making it difficult to distinguish staged crashes from the genuine traffic incidents that occurred regularly on the dangerous highways. Whitlow assigned Aldridge to begin a discreet investigation into Cold Iron's towing operation, focusing on financial records and business relationships that might reveal connections to insurance fraud networks. The deputy approached the task carefully, using public records and open-source information rather than formal subpoenas that would alert the targets that they were under investigation. What emerged was a picture of a business operation that seemed to generate income beyond what normal towing services would produce, with financial patterns suggesting payments from sources that had no obvious connection to legitimate accident recovery work. Cold Iron maintained relationships with several auto body shops and salvage yards throughout the region, operations that appeared to route business exclusively through his towing service despite being geographically dispersed enough that such exclusivity seemed logistically unlikely without some underlying coordination. The investigation uncovered evidence that Cold Iron had been working with a network of individuals involved in various aspects of insurance fraud, from staged accidents to exaggerated injury claims to inflated repair estimates. The network included body shop owners who documented more damage than actually occurred, medical providers who billed for treatments that were never provided, and attorneys who specialized in maximizing insurance settlements through aggressive negotiation and litigation. Cold Iron's role appeared to be controlling the initial response to accidents, ensuring that vehicles were recovered and processed in ways that supported the fraud narrative, while preventing independent examination that might reveal the staged nature of the incidents. What made the operation particularly sophisticated was how it blended legitimate accident response with criminal activity. Cold Iron's company did respond to genuine accidents and provided real towing services, which meant that most of their work was completely legal and created cover for the fraudulent cases that generated the bulk of their profits. The staged accidents were interspersed among legitimate crashes, carefully planned to occur in locations and circumstances that would make them appear to be unfortunate but explicable incidents rather than crimes. The frequency of real accidents on gorge highways meant that adding a few staged crashes to the annual total wouldn't trigger statistical anomalies that might draw attention from insurance companies or law enforcement agencies. Whitlow faced the challenge of proving that specific accidents were staged rather than genuine without physical evidence that had been destroyed years earlier. The guardrail tampering that Bellwether's private investigator had documented couldn't be verified because the damaged sections had been replaced and discarded. The vehicles involved in the crashes had been scrapped or sold, making it impossible to conduct detailed mechanical inspections that might reveal evidence of sabotage. The survivors who'd mentioned seeing other vehicles on the road before their accidents had never provided descriptions detailed enough to identify suspects, and their memories had likely become less reliable with time and trauma. The investigation would need to focus on the financial fraud and conspiracy elements, building cases around documented payments and communications that could prove coordination rather than trying to reconstruct the specific mechanics of crashes that had occurred years earlier. The breakthrough came when Aldridge identified a pattern in how accident victims were recruited into the fraud network after their crashes occurred. Several individuals who'd been involved in legitimate accidents on gorge highways had subsequently filed suspicious insurance claims for injuries that seemed exaggerated or inconsistent with the actual crash circumstances. Investigation revealed that these individuals had been approached while their vehicles were being recovered by Cold Iron's tow service, offered assistance in navigating insurance claims, and connected with attorneys and medical providers who would maximize their settlements. The victims often didn't realize they were participating in fraud, believing they were simply accepting help from people who wanted to ensure they received fair compensation for their accidents. This recruitment pattern provided investigators with a way to penetrate the fraud network by interviewing accident victims who'd been approached with offers of assistance. Many of these individuals were willing to cooperate once they understood that the help they'd received was actually part of a criminal conspiracy, and that their participation might expose them to legal consequences. The interviews revealed detailed information about how the network operated, including specific instructions victims had received about exaggerating symptoms and maintaining consistent stories when dealing with insurance adjusters and medical evaluators. Some victims had been paid directly to inflate their claims, while others had received compensation through inflated settlement amounts that were then partially kicked back to the network operators. The investigation expanded to include state insurance fraud investigators and federal authorities who had expertise in prosecuting organized fraud conspiracies. The combined resources allowed for comprehensive financial analysis and surveillance operations that documented the network's activities in real time. Investigators traced money flows between towing operations, body shops, medical clinics, and law firms, creating maps of relationships that showed how the conspiracy functioned across multiple jurisdictions and involved dozens of participants. The scope of the fraud was larger than Whitlow had initially suspected, with evidence suggesting that the network had been operating for at least a decade and had generated millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims. The question of whether the fraud operation had escalated to murder remained difficult to prove, despite Bellwether's conviction that her husband had been killed to prevent him from exposing the conspiracy. The guardrail tampering evidence was gone, and without physical proof that her husband's accident had been staged, prosecutors were reluctant to pursue murder charges that would be difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt. The fraud charges were substantial and would result in significant prison time for the network's organizers, but they didn't provide the kind of justice that Bellwether sought for her husband's death. Whitlow tried to explain the legal constraints to her, but he could see the frustration and disappointment in her response. She'd spent 3 years fighting to have her husband's death taken seriously, and being told that the best outcome was prosecution for insurance fraud rather than murder felt like another form of dismissal. As the investigation progressed toward indictments, strange things began happening that suggested the network was aware of law enforcement scrutiny and was taking steps to protect itself. Key witnesses who'd agreed to cooperate suddenly became unavailable or changed their stories, claiming they'd been mistaken about what they'd observed or that they'd been coerced into making false statements. Documents that had been subpoenaed arrived with pages missing or information redacted beyond what privacy laws required. Surveillance operations were disrupted by equipment failures and by suspects who seemed to know when they were being watched and adjusted their behavior accordingly. The pattern suggested that someone with access to investigation details was feeding information to the network, possibly someone within law enforcement or the insurance industry who had financial interest in protecting the conspiracy. Whitlow tightened security around the investigation, limiting access to case files and conducting sensitive interviews outside normal channels where conversations might be monitored. The paranoia of investigating corruption within his own professional community was exhausting and demoralizing, requiring him to question the loyalty of colleagues he'd worked with for years. Aldridge remained one of the few people Whitlow trusted completely, and the two of them worked increasingly long hours to build cases that would survive legal challenges and withstand whatever interference the network might arrange through compromised officials. The investigation became a race to secure enough evidence to support arrests before the network could destroy records or intimidate witnesses into silence. The arrests, when they finally came, were coordinated across multiple jurisdictions, with law enforcement teams executing search warrants simultaneously at dozens of locations to prevent suspects from destroying evidence or fleeing. Silas Coldern was arrested at his towing company office, along with 17 other individuals identified as key participants in the fraud network. The charges included conspiracy, insurance fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice, with prosecutors indicating that additional charges might follow as the investigation continued. Coldiron's attorney immediately began negotiating for a plea agreement, suggesting that his client might be willing to provide information about other participants in exchange for reduced sentencing. What Coldiron offered during those negotiations was confirmation that at least 2 of the fatal accidents had been deliberately staged, including the crash that killed Bellwether's husband. According to Coldiron's account, the decision to escalate from fraud to murder had been made by network organizers who learned that Bellwether's husband was planning to report their activities to authorities. The guardrail had been compromised as Bellwether's investigator had suspected, and the crash had been timed to occur when her husband was driving a route he traveled regularly. Coldiron claimed he'd opposed the decision to stage a fatal accident, but had participated out of fear that refusing would make him a target for elimination. His testimony provided the first direct evidence that the fraud network had committed murder, but it also raised questions about why Coldiron had waited years to come forward, and whether his cooperation was motivated by genuine remorse or simply by desire to minimize his own legal exposure. The murder charges brought against the network's organizers faced significant legal challenges despite Coldiron's testimony. Defense attorneys argued that his account was the uncorroborated statement of a co-conspirator seeking favorable treatment from prosecutors, and that without physical evidence or additional witnesses, the testimony shouldn't be sufficient to support murder convictions. The destroyed guardrail evidence remained a critical gap that prosecutors struggled to overcome, and the passage of time since the murder occurred had allowed memories to fade and evidence to deteriorate in ways that made reconstruction of events increasingly difficult. The trial, when it finally occurred, would test whether Coldiron's testimony and the circumstantial evidence of the fraud conspiracy would be enough to convince a jury that murder had occurred. Bellwether attended every day of the trial proceedings, sitting in the courtroom gallery and listening to testimony that finally validated what she'd been trying to tell people for years. Whitlow saw her relief at having the murder acknowledged publicly, but he also saw her understanding that legal recognition didn't guarantee the conviction she sought. The trial lasted weeks, with defense attorneys systematically attacking every piece of evidence and every witness the prosecution presented. Coldiron's testimony was subjected to brutal cross-examination that highlighted his own criminal participation and his motivation to fabricate stories that would benefit him personally. The jury deliberated for days before returning verdicts that convicted the network organizers on fraud charges but acquitted them of murder, finding that the evidence was insufficient to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Bellwether's husband's death had been deliberately caused. The outcome was devastating for Bellwether, but not entirely surprising to Whitlow, who'd seen enough criminal trials to understand that legal standards for proof were often higher than what seemed reasonable to people seeking justice for lost loved ones. The fraud convictions meant that the network's organizers would serve substantial prison time, and the civil lawsuits that followed would likely bankrupt their businesses and seize assets that had been accumulated through years of criminal activity. It was a form of accountability, even if it wasn't the murder convictions that Bellwether had fought for. And Whitlow tried to help her see that dismantling the network and preventing future fraud was meaningful achievement, even if it didn't fully answer what happened to her husband. The investigation had revealed other suspicious deaths that might be connected to the fraud network. Accident victims whose families had never suspected anything other than tragic chance. Whitlow began reviewing these cases with the same scrutiny that Aldridge had applied to the original cluster of accidents, looking for patterns that might indicate additional murders disguised as crashes. The work was painstaking and often discouraging, each case requiring hours of analysis that might ultimately prove that an accident was simply an accident rather than evidence of crime. But the possibility that more victims existed and that their families deserved to know what really happened drove Whitlow to continue the reviews even after the fraud prosecutions were completed. Years after the initial investigation began, Whitlow still drove Highway 14 through the Columbia Gorge, with a different awareness of the landscape and its dangers. The narrow road carved into cliff faces still produced regular accidents from legitimate causes: weather, driver error, mechanical failure. But now he also saw the locations where murders had been staged to look like tragic misfortune, where guardrails had been compromised and crashes had been engineered to produce deaths that would generate insurance payouts and salvage profits while families mourned what they believed were senseless accidents. The gorge was beautiful and deadly, and Whitlow had learned that some of its dangers were deliberately created by people who saw tragedy as a business opportunity rather than as a reason for compassion or caution. The case files documenting the fraud network investigation filled multiple cabinets at the sheriff's office, thousands of pages of evidence and testimony that had taken years to compile and would remain available for any future investigations that might reveal additional victims or participants. Whitlow reviewed these files occasionally, still troubled by the murder acquittals and by the knowledge that some organizers of the network had avoided prosecution entirely by maintaining distance from the most serious crimes. Justice in complex conspiracy cases was always incomplete, some criminals escaping accountability, while others paid prices that might not reflect their actual level of involvement in the network's activities. Bellwether eventually moved away from the gorge, unable to continue living in an area where every drive along Highway 14 reminded her of her husband's death and the years she'd spent fighting to have that death recognized as murder rather than accident. She stayed in contact with Whitlow occasionally, updating him when civil litigation against the fraud network produced settlements that at least provided financial compensation, if not the criminal convictions she'd sought. The sheriff understood her need to leave, but regretted losing someone who'd demonstrated the kind of persistent advocacy that often made the difference between crimes being solved and being absorbed into statistics that claimed accidents when murder had actually occurred. The towing contract for Highway 14 accident recovery was rebid after Cold Iron's conviction, with new companies taking over the work under enhanced oversight and monitoring requirements. The salvage operations and body shops connected to the fraud network were either closed or sold to new owners who operated under intense scrutiny from insurance investigators. The medical providers and attorneys who'd participated in exaggerating claims faced professional sanctions and license suspensions that ended their involvement in the conspiracy, even if criminal charges hadn't been filed against them. The network had been dismantled systematically, if imperfectly, and Whitlow took some satisfaction in knowing that the investigation had prevented future fraud, even if it hadn't achieved complete justice for past crimes. The gorge continued to be one of Oregon's most dangerous highways, statistics confirming that single-vehicle accidents occurred with troubling frequency along the narrow roads that connected small communities to larger cities. Whitlow knew that most of these crashes were genuine accidents resulting from challenging driving conditions and human error. But he also knew that determining which accidents were crimes would remain difficult work requiring the kind of careful analysis that Aldridge had brought to the original investigation. The deputy had since been promoted and transferred to a larger department, but his legacy remained in the changed awareness of how fraud networks could exploit accident-prone locations to generate profits, while hiding behind the cover of tragic misfortune that required no further explanation than bad luck and dangerous roads. Sheriff Rourke Tetherow knew the call was serious when dispatch patched through Del Rainwater's voice, strained and urgent in a way that the paramedics' usual professional calm never allowed. Rainwater was calling from somewhere in the backcountry south of the Rogue River, coordinates coming through broken and uncertain because cell signal in that terrain was marginal at best, and the stress in his voice suggested he was dealing with injuries that made precise communication difficult. Someone had triggered an explosive device at what appeared to be an illegal marijuana grow site, Rainwater explained, and he'd been close enough to respond to the initial distress call but was now dealing with blast injuries that required immediate evacuation and backup that could secure a scene where additional hazards were likely present. Deputy Ephra Hembry was already en route from a patrol stop 20 miles north, but the terrain between the highway and Rainwater's location would require off-road vehicles and careful navigation through logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Tetherow coordinated the response while driving toward the general area where Rainwater had last transmitted clear coordinates, calling in additional deputies and requesting support from state police who had experience with clandestine drug operations and the violent security measures that sometimes protected them. Illegal grow sites in southern Oregon had become increasingly sophisticated over the past decade, transitioning from small-scale cultivation, hidden in national forest land, to industrial operations that involved serious money and serious criminals who protected their investments with surveillance systems, armed guards, and booby traps designed to injure or kill anyone who stumbled onto their locations. The Rogue River area was particularly attractive for these operations because the terrain provided natural concealment and water access, while being remote enough that law enforcement patrols were infrequent and local residents learned not to investigate activity they observed in the backcountry. Hembry reached Rainwater's position first, radioing back that the paramedic was conscious and providing self-treatment for shrapnel wounds to his legs and torso, but would need hospital transport as soon as evacuation could be arranged. The victim who'd triggered the initial explosion was in worse condition, unconscious and suffering from severe trauma that Rainwater had been trying to stabilize with limited supplies and no backup when Hembry arrived. The deputy established a perimeter around the immediate area and began documenting what he could observe without moving deeper into the grow site where additional traps might be positioned. From his vantage point, Hembry could see rows of marijuana plants in various stages of growth, irrigation systems fed by hoses running from the nearby river, and camping equipment suggesting that guards lived on site during cultivation and harvest periods. Tetherow arrived 30 minutes later with additional personnel and equipment for securing a potentially hostile scene. The first priority was evacuating the injured, getting Rainwater and the explosion victim to a location where a medical helicopter could land and transport them to the regional trauma center in Medford. The evacuation took careful coordination, with deputies clearing a route back to an old logging landing that could serve as helicopter pad while others maintained watch for any indication that whoever operated the grow site might still be present and willing to defend their operation. The paranoia of working a scene where every step might trigger another explosive, or where armed guards might be observing from concealed positions, created tension that made routine evidence collection feel like tactical combat operations. Once the injured were evacuated, Tetherow began the systematic documentation of the grow site, photographing the layout and evidence before attempting to search areas that might contain additional hazards. The site was larger than initial observations had suggested, covering several acres of cleared forest land that had been terraced and irrigated to support thousands of marijuana plants. The sophistication of the operation was immediately apparent in the irrigation infrastructure, the quality of the cultivation equipment, and the living quarters that had been established for the workers who tended the crops. This wasn't amateur gardening hidden in the woods. This was commercial agriculture conducted illegally on public or private land, by people who'd invested significant resources and who would have strong motivation to protect that investment from law enforcement or rival operators. The explosive device that had injured Rainwater and the other victim appeared to have been a command-detonated charge rather than a simple tripwire mechanism, which suggested that someone had been monitoring the site and had deliberately triggered the explosion when they observed intruders approaching the grow area. Tetherow found what appeared to be surveillance camera positions in trees surrounding the site, though the cameras themselves had been removed, probably within hours of the explosion when the operators realized that law enforcement would be responding to the incident. The remote detonation capability meant that whoever triggered the device had been watching in real time and had made a conscious decision to use potentially lethal force against people who might have been hikers, hunters, or simply lost rather than deliberate threats to the operation. Deputy Hembry discovered evidence that the grow site had been active for multiple growing seasons, with layers of agricultural waste and patterns of soil amendment, suggesting that this location had been used repeatedly rather than being a single-season operation. The investment in infrastructure and the accumulation of supplies indicated that the operators intended to continue using the site for future cultivation, which meant they might return to salvage equipment or protect their investment unless law enforcement maintained a presence that discouraged such attempts. Tetherow posted deputies to monitor the site while he worked with prosecutors to obtain search warrants and coordinate with drug enforcement agencies that had jurisdiction over major cultivation operations on federal land. The investigation into who operated the grow site began with trying to identify the explosion victim, who remained unconscious and unidentified at the trauma center where Rainwater had also been admitted for treatment of his injuries. The victim carried no identification, and his fingerprints weren't in any law enforcement database that might provide name or criminal history. His clothing and equipment suggested outdoor work, but nothing distinctive enough to indicate whether he was involved in operating the grow site or was simply someone who'd encountered it while engaged in legitimate activities. Rainwater regained consciousness and was able to provide some context for how he'd encountered the victim, explaining that he'd been responding to a distress call from a hiker who'd reported hearing an explosion and finding someone injured in the woods. Rainwater had located the victim and was providing medical treatment when the second explosion occurred, suggesting that whoever was monitoring the site had decided that eliminating witnesses was preferable to allowing them to report the grow operation's location. The hiker who'd made the initial distress call had left the area before Rainwater arrived, and attempts to identify and locate this person proved unsuccessful. The call had come from a disposable phone that was no longer in service, and the caller had provided minimal information before disconnecting. This pattern suggested that the hiker might have been connected to the grow operation somehow, possibly a worker or associate who'd panicked after witnessing the first explosion and called for help before reconsidering the wisdom of involving emergency services in a situation that would inevitably draw law enforcement attention. The disposable phone and lack of identifying information created an investigative dead end that Tetherow noted but couldn't immediately pursue without additional leads. State police assigned a detective with specialized experience in investigating illegal marijuana operations to work with Tetherow on building a case against whoever operated the grow site. The detective brought expertise in tracking the financial networks that supported large-scale cultivation, explaining that operations of this size typically involved organized groups that controlled multiple grow sites across different jurisdictions, and that coordinated their activities through sophisticated communication and logistics systems. The marijuana produced at sites like this one was destined for markets in other states where prices remained high enough to justify the risks of illegal cultivation and interstate trafficking. Identifying the operators would require following money trails and supply chains, rather than simply trying to catch workers at the grow site who were typically low-level participants with limited knowledge of the broader organization. The financial investigation revealed that the land where the grow site was located belonged to a man named Cassio Stroud, who owned several hundred acres of forested property along the Rogue River that he'd acquired through a series of transactions over the past decade. Stroud had no criminal record and presented himself as a small-scale timber investor who purchased marginal forest land and managed it for eventual harvest or resale. His financial records showed modest income from timber sales and property management, nothing that would suggest involvement in illegal drug operations or that would support the kind of investment required to establish sophisticated grow sites. Tetherow and the state detective obtained warrants to search Stroud's property and financial records, looking for evidence that would connect him directly to the marijuana cultivation occurring on land he owned. The search of Stroud's residence produced limited evidence of his involvement in the grow operation, though investigators found maps that marked the locations of multiple sites on his property and communication records that suggested he was in contact with people who might be managing the cultivation activities. Stroud claimed that he leased portions of his land to agricultural tenants and that he had no knowledge of what specific crops they were growing on remote parcels that he rarely visited personally. His attorneys argued that property ownership didn't constitute proof of involvement in illegal activities conducted by tenants, and that charging Stroud would require evidence showing he knowingly participated in or profited from the marijuana cultivation, rather than simply being a landlord whose property was misused by criminal tenants. The explosion victim regained consciousness after several days in intensive care and provided information that complicated the investigation's direction. His name was Marcus, and he worked as a freelance environmental consultant who'd been hired to conduct surveys of riparian habitat along the Rogue River as part of a grant-funded restoration project. He'd encountered the grow site while conducting his survey work and had been photographing the irrigation systems that were drawing water from the river when the first explosion occurred. The blast had thrown him into dense brush, and he'd been trying to orient himself and call for help when the second explosion injured both him and the paramedic who'd arrived in response to the distress call that someone else had made. His account suggested he was an innocent victim rather than someone involved in operating the grow site, though Tetherow noted inconsistencies in his story that warranted further investigation. The environmental consulting work provided Marcus with legitimate reasons to be in remote backcountry areas where grow sites were typically located, but it also provided convenient cover for someone who might be scouting locations or monitoring operations for people involved in illegal cultivation. Tetherow requested records from the organization that had allegedly hired Marcus for the survey work, and discovered that while the grant project existed, Marcus's contract had ended months before the explosion occurred, and he shouldn't have been conducting surveys in that area at the time he was injured. When confronted with this information, Marcus modified his account, claiming he'd been doing preliminary work for a potential future contract and had been in the area on his own initiative rather than as part of official employment. The investigation into Marcus's background revealed connections to people with criminal histories involving drug trafficking and illegal cultivation operations. His financial records showed deposits that were larger and more frequent than his legitimate consulting income would explain, and communications found on his seized phone suggested he'd been providing location scouting and security consulting services to marijuana growers who were willing to pay well for expertise in identifying suitable sites and assessing law enforcement risks. The picture emerging was of someone who operated in the gray area between legitimate environmental work and criminal support services, using his professional credentials to access remote areas while gathering information that could be sold to people operating illegal grow operations. Tetherow arrested Marcus on charges related to his involvement in the marijuana cultivation operation, though proving the full extent of his participation would require additional evidence linking him to specific grow sites and demonstrating that he'd received payment for services beyond simple consulting. Marcus's attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement under which he would provide information about the people who'd hired him and the other grow sites he'd helped establish in exchange for reduced charges. The information he provided led investigators to multiple cultivation operations throughout southern Oregon and northern California, a network of sites that appeared to be controlled by a coordinated organization rather than independent operators working separately. The cooperation agreement revealed that Cassio Stroud was more deeply involved in the grow operation than his initial denials had suggested. According to Marcus, Stroud didn't just lease land to growers. He actively participated in site selection, provided security consulting based on his knowledge of law enforcement patrol patterns, and received substantial payments that were structured to avoid creating obvious financial trails. Stroud had developed relationships with multiple growers over years of involvement in the illegal marijuana industry, building a reputation as someone who could provide secure locations and protection from law enforcement discovery. The grow site where the explosions occurred was one of several that Stroud controlled, and the decision to use explosive devices for security had been made jointly between Stroud and the cultivation crew that operated the site. Armed with Marcus's testimony and the evidence collected from the grow site and Stroud's property, prosecutors filed conspiracy and drug trafficking charges against Stroud and several associates identified as participating in the cultivation network. The charges included special enhancements related to the use of explosive devices and the injuries inflicted on Dell, Rainwater, and Marcus, allegations that carried significantly longer potential sentences than simple marijuana cultivation charges. Stroud's attorneys mounted an aggressive defense that challenged Marcus's credibility and argued that the evidence of Stroud's involvement was circumstantial and insufficient to prove knowing participation in criminal activity beyond reasonable doubt. The case proceeded through months of pretrial motions and discovery disputes, while Tetherow continued investigating other aspects of the cultivation network that Marcus had described. Additional grow sites were located and dismantled, each one revealing similar patterns of sophisticated irrigation, security measures, and infrastructure investment that confirmed these were professional operations rather than casual cultivation by amateur growers. The scope of the network suggested that hundreds of thousands of marijuana plants were being cultivated annually on remote parcels throughout southern Oregon, generating millions of dollars in revenue for organizers while creating environmental damage and public safety hazards that local communities had to absorb. Dell Rainwater recovered from his injuries but faced a long rehabilitation process that would keep him out of work for months. Tetherow visited him during his hospital stay and later at his home, discussing the investigation and the broader implications of encountering booby-trapped grow sites while responding to emergency calls in backcountry areas. Rainwater expressed frustration that his medical training and willingness to help someone in distress had nearly gotten him killed by people who saw human life as expendable compared to protecting their criminal investments. The paramedic had worked emergency services in rural Oregon for 15 years and had responded to countless calls in remote locations, but he'd never considered that he might be deliberately targeted by criminals who viewed emergency responders as threats to be eliminated rather than as neutral parties providing humanitarian assistance. The trial of Cassio Stroud and his co-defendants consumed weeks of court time, with prosecutors presenting evidence of the cultivation network's scope and the defendants' roles in establishing and operating multiple grow sites. Marcus testified about his interactions with Stroud and described how the network functioned, providing details about site selection criteria, security protocols, and distribution arrangements that moved harvested marijuana out of Oregon to markets in other states. Defense attorneys attacked Marcus's credibility relentlessly, highlighting his own criminal participation and suggesting that his testimony was motivated by self-interest rather than truthfulness. The jury deliberated for several days before returning mixed verdicts that convicted Stroud and some associates on conspiracy charges while acquitting others of specific counts related to individual grow sites. The convictions resulted in substantial prison sentences for Stroud and the core organizers of the cultivation network, But Tetherow recognized that dismantling one operation wouldn't eliminate the underlying conditions that made illegal marijuana cultivation profitable and relatively low risk in southern Oregon's remote backcountry. The combination of suitable climate, available land, and limited law enforcement presence would continue to attract growers who saw opportunities for substantial income with acceptable levels of risk. The challenge for rural sheriffs was developing strategies for detecting and disrupting these operations before they became established enough to invest in sophisticated security measures that posed dangers to anyone who encountered them. The grow site where Rainwater and Marcus were injured was eventually cleared, and the land was restored as much as possible, given the environmental damage that had occurred during years of cultivation. The irrigation systems were dismantled, the terraced growing areas were seeded with native vegetation, and the camping structures were removed to eliminate any infrastructure that might encourage reuse of the location. Tetherow arranged for regular patrols of the area to discourage anyone from attempting to re-establish cultivation operations, though he knew that enforcement resources were limited and that determined growers could probably find other suitable locations on the vast stretches of remote land that characterized southern Oregon's geography. Months after the trial concluded, Tetherow received information from an informant suggesting that elements of the dismantled cultivation network were attempting to re-establish operations using different landowners and different security approaches that would be harder for law enforcement to detect and disrupt. The informant described plans for smaller, more dispersed grow sites that would be harder to locate through aerial surveillance, and security measures that relied on human guards rather than explosive devices that attracted attention when they injured innocent people. The evolution of cultivation tactics in response to law enforcement pressure was a constant challenge, requiring sheriffs and drug enforcement agencies to continuously adapt their detection and investigation methods to counter increasingly sophisticated criminal operations. The case files documenting the investigation filled several boxes in the sheriff's office evidence room, containing thousands of pages of financial records, surveillance reports, and testimony that had been necessary to build prosecutable cases against the network's organizers. Tetherow reviewed these materials occasionally when new information surfaced about possible cultivation operations, looking for patterns that might help identify emerging networks before they became fully established. The work was never finished in any permanent sense. Each successful prosecution created temporary disruption, but didn't eliminate the economic incentives that drove people to risk criminal charges in pursuit of the substantial profits available from illegal marijuana cultivation. Del Rainwater eventually returned to work as a paramedic, though he approached calls in remote backcountry areas with new wariness about potential hazards that had nothing to do with medical emergencies. He carried additional safety equipment and coordinated more closely with law enforcement when responding to incidents in areas known for illegal cultivation activity. The experience had changed his perspective on the risks inherent in emergency medical work in rural environments, teaching him that the greatest dangers sometimes came not from the injuries he was treating, but from the criminal context in which those injuries occurred. Tetherow drove past the location of the former grow site occasionally when patrol routes took him along the logging roads that accessed that section of the Rogue River drainage. The land looked peaceful and unremarkable, showing few obvious signs of the industrial agriculture that had occupied it for years or the violence that had erupted when that operation was discovered. The sheriff knew that similar sites existed throughout his jurisdiction and beyond, hidden in forests and canyons where cultivators calculated that isolation provided sufficient protection from discovery. The challenge was finding these operations before someone was injured or killed, before the environmental damage became irreversible, and before the networks became so established that dismantling them required years of investigation and prosecution. The explosion that injured Rainwater and Marcus had been a moment of visible violence in what was otherwise a largely invisible criminal enterprise, bringing public attention to illegal cultivation in ways that most grow site discoveries never achieved. The media coverage of the trial and the paramedics' injuries had created pressure for more aggressive enforcement against marijuana cultivation operations. But Tetherow understood that public attention was fleeting, and that the difficult work of investigating and prosecuting these cases would continue long after news coverage moved to other topics. The reality of rural law enforcement was that resources would always be limited. Criminal organizations would always adapt to enforcement pressures, and sheriffs would always be fighting to stay ahead of evolving tactics while trying to protect communities and landscapes from exploitation. Years after the initial explosion, Tetherow still thought about the case when he encountered reports of suspicious activity in backcountry areas, or when he heard about injuries related to booby-trapped grow sites in other jurisdictions. The Rogue River operation had been one of many, its dismantling a temporary victory in an ongoing struggle that would continue as long as economic incentives existed for illegal cultivation, and as long as rural areas offered the isolation and resources that made such operations viable. The sheriff had learned to measure success in increments rather than in absolute terms, understanding that each prosecution disrupted networks and protected communities even if it didn't eliminate the underlying problems that generated new criminal enterprises to replace those that were dismantled. The case remained a reminder that rural law enforcement required constant vigilance, and that the peaceful appearance of forested landscapes could conceal industrial-scale criminal operations that posed serious threats to public safety and environmental health. Tetherow shared information from the investigation with other sheriffs working similar cases in jurisdictions throughout Oregon and neighboring states, contributing to a collective understanding of how cultivation networks operated and how they might be detected and disrupted more effectively. The work was collaborative and incremental, building on lessons learned from each investigation to improve strategies for protecting rural communities from exploitation by people who saw remote land as opportunity rather than as shared resource deserving protection and respect. Sheriff Keats Rook had been monitoring the storm system moving through the Cascades for 2 days before the domestic disturbance call came through from a location that made response complicated in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. The mountain house sat at 4,800 feet elevation on a private road that the county didn't maintain during winter months, accessible only by vehicles with chains and serious clearance when conditions were good, impassable completely when snowfall exceeded 2 feet. Dispatcher Ida Larkspur relayed the call with unusual terseness, noting that the caller had identified herself as needing immediate assistance due to a domestic violence situation, but had provided minimal details before the call disconnected. Deputy Hollis Fenwick was already responding from a position 15 miles downslope, but Rook knew from experience that reaching the location would take at least 90 minutes in current conditions. The address was registered to a man named Vale Ashdown, information that triggered immediate concern for Rook, because Ashdown was a former sheriff's deputy who'd left law enforcement under circumstances that remained disputed and uncomfortable. Ashdown had worked for a neighboring county for 8 years, before being forced to resign following an internal investigation into his use of force during arrest situations and his relationships with female witnesses in domestic violence cases. The investigation hadn't resulted in criminal charges, but the findings had been serious enough that Ashdown couldn't find law enforcement work afterward and had eventually left the region entirely. Or so Rook had believed, until Larkspur's information revealed that he'd apparently returned and purchased property in the mountains where isolation would shield him from scrutiny. Rook radioed Fenwick with background on Ashdown and instructions to wait for backup before making contact at the residence, emphasizing that approaching a former law enforcement officer in a potential domestic violence situation required tactical awareness that exceeded normal response protocols. Fenwick acknowledged the caution, but noted that waiting for additional units would add significant time to an already prolonged response, and that whoever had called for help might not have the luxury of waiting. The tension between officer safety and victim protection was a constant challenge in rural law enforcement, where distances and limited personnel created situations that required individual deputies to make judgment calls that could prove fatal if their assessments were wrong. Rook left the office and drove toward the mountain location himself, knowing that his presence might help de-escalate a situation involving a former colleague who would understand chain of command. The drive took him through deteriorating weather conditions as elevation increased, snow falling heavily enough that visibility dropped to the length of his headlight beams, and the road surface disappeared beneath accumulation that made lane markings impossible to distinguish. He passed Fenwick at a turnoff where the deputy had stopped to chain up his patrol vehicle, and the two briefly coordinated their approach while acknowledging that circumstances might force them to make entry before a complete tactical team could be assembled. The mountain house appeared through the snowfall as a dark shape set back from the road among stands of Douglas fir that creaked and dropped loads of accumulated snow when wind gusts shook their branches. Lights were visible through windows on the ground floor, and two vehicles were parked in a cleared area near the front entrance, both covered with enough fresh snow to suggest they'd been stationary for hours. Rook parked his vehicle in a position that would allow quick departure if necessary while also providing cover if the situation deteriorated. Fenwick arrived minutes later and positioned his vehicle to block the driveway exit, standard procedure for domestic calls where suspects might attempt to flee when law enforcement arrived. Rook approached the front entrance while Fenwick moved to cover the rear of the house, both deputies maintaining radio contact despite the snow and wind that made observation difficult. The sheriff knocked and identified himself, calling out that he was responding to a distress call and needed to speak with whoever was inside the residence. The response came after a delay long enough to suggest discussion or preparation was occurring before anyone approached the door. When it finally opened, Ashdown stood in the entrance looking exactly like Rook remembered him from encounters years earlier, physically imposing, carefully controlled in his movements and expression, projecting the kind of confident authority that came from extensive law enforcement training. Ashdown invited Rook inside with practiced courtesy, explaining that there'd been a misunderstanding and that no emergency existed that would require law enforcement intervention. His wife had been startled by something during the storm and had called for help before realizing that the perceived threat was simply wind-blown debris striking the house, Ashdown claimed. She was embarrassed by the unnecessary response and had tried to call back to cancel the dispatch but hadn't been able to get cell signal to complete the call. Rook listened to this explanation while simultaneously observing Ashdown's body language and scanning the visible portions of the residence for any evidence that would contradict the benign account being provided. The interior of the house showed no obvious signs of violence or struggle, furniture arranged normally, and no visible damage that would suggest physical altercation had occurred. Ashdown maintained his position near the entrance, not blocking Rook's access but clearly prepared to control the interaction and limit the sheriff's movement through the residence. The calculated positioning and rehearsed explanation raised Rook's suspicions, despite the absence of visible evidence supporting the distress call. Years of responding to domestic situations had taught him that the most dangerous calls were often those where everything appeared calm on the surface, while violence simmered beneath carefully maintained facades of normalcy. Rook asked to speak with Ashdown's wife directly, standard protocol for domestic calls that required verification that alleged victims were safe and uncoerced. Ashdown's response was measured agreement accompanied by the explanation that his wife was resting upstairs after the earlier fright had left her shaken and exhausted. He offered to wake her if the sheriff insisted, but suggested that allowing her to rest might be more considerate given that no actual emergency existed. The deflection was subtle but clear, and Rook recognized the tactical communication style of someone trained to control situations through verbal manipulation and assertion of authority. The sheriff declined the offer to leave without speaking to the wife, explaining that protocol required direct contact to verify her safety. Ashdown's expression shifted slightly, frustration bleeding through the professional courtesy as he recognized that Rook wouldn't be dismissed easily. The standoff lasted several uncomfortable moments before a woman's voice called from the second floor, saying she would come down and that there was no need for concern. Her tone carried the kind of careful neutrality that Rook had heard countless times in domestic situations, the vocal equivalent of walking on ice while trying not to crack the surface beneath. The woman who descended the stairs identified herself as Ashdown's wife, but didn't provide a first name, maintaining the formal distance that suggested she'd been coached on how to interact with law enforcement. She was in her early 30s, younger than Ashdown by at least 15 years, and she moved with the kind of cautious deliberation that people adopted when they were afraid of triggering violence through wrong movements or words. Her physical appearance showed no obvious injuries, no bruising or marks that would indicate recent assault, but Rook noted how she avoided eye contact and positioned herself to maintain distance from Ashdown while simultaneously staying within his line of sight. Rook asked whether she'd made the distress call and whether she needed any assistance or wanted to speak with him privately. Her response was textbook victim denial, explaining that she'd overreacted to sounds during the storm and felt foolish for calling emergency services when no actual threat existed. She apologized for wasting law enforcement time during dangerous weather conditions, using language that seemed scripted rather than spontaneous. Ashdown remained silent during this exchange, but his presence dominated the room, a constant pressure that shaped how his wife spoke and moved even without explicit threats. Deputy Fenwick appeared at the back entrance having completed his perimeter check, and his arrival shifted the dynamics as Ashdown was forced to monitor 2 law enforcement officers simultaneously. Fenwick reported that he'd observed no signs of disturbance outside the residence. Rook made eye contact with his deputy and recognized the same unease he was feeling, the sense that something was wrong despite the absence of visible evidence. The challenge was determining whether that unease justified forcing the issue and potentially escalating a situation that might genuinely be resolved. Rook asked to speak with the wife privately, separating her from Ashdown's direct presence to provide opportunity for disclosure if she was being coerced. Ashdown objected immediately, citing privacy concerns and suggesting that the request exceeded reasonable response to a canceled emergency call. His objection was phrased in law enforcement terminology, references to Fourth Amendment protections, and lack of probable cause creating legal framework for refusing cooperation. Rook countered by noting that he had obligation to verify the welfare of anyone who called for emergency assistance, and that refusal to allow private conversation would constitute obstruction. The legal sparring continued for several exchanges before Ashdown relented with visible reluctance, allowing his wife to speak with Rook in the kitchen while he remained in the living room with Fenwick. The separation was minimal. Voices would carry between rooms and Ashdown could observe most of the kitchen through an open doorway, but it provided enough privacy that the wife might feel able to disclose information. Rook used his body position to block Ashdown's direct line of sight while asking whether the wife felt safe in the residence and whether she wanted assistance leaving. Her responses remained carefully neutral, insisting that no abuse was occurring and that the distress call had been a mistake born from storm-induced anxiety. Rook pressed gently, asking about the nature of her relationship with Ashdown and whether she understood that help was available if she wanted to leave. She became increasingly uncomfortable with the questioning, glancing toward the living room where Ashdown waited and eventually requesting that the conversation end. The request was framed as personal choice rather than coercion, but Rook recognized the patterns of domestic violence victims who'd been conditioned to protect their abusers and who couldn't risk disclosure while still trapped in proximity to the people they feared. Before leaving, Rook provided the wife with information about domestic violence resources and emergency contact numbers. standard procedure for calls that didn't result in arrests but where concerns remained. He also made clear that law enforcement would respond immediately if another call came from the residence. The wife accepted the information with minimal acknowledgement, setting the papers aside in a way that suggested they would probably be disposed of as soon as law enforcement departed. Ashdown walked Rook and Fenwick to the door, resuming his earlier courtesy now that the immediate confrontation had passed. He thanked them for responding despite the weather, acknowledging that it must be frustrating to drive dangerous roads for calls that turned out to be false alarms. The comments were calculated to reframe the interaction as reasonable cooperation, and Ashdown's law enforcement background was evident in how skillfully he managed the departure. Rook accepted the framing because arguing further would serve no purpose, but he filed the entire interaction as unresolved concern that warranted future attention. The drive back down the mountain gave Rook time to review the call with Fenwick, both officers expressing frustration with how the situation had resolved while acknowledging the legal and practical limits of what they could accomplish. The wife had denied being in danger and had declined offers of assistance, which meant that absent evidence of a crime or explicit request for protection, law enforcement authority to intervene was constrained. The fact that Ashdown was a former law enforcement officer complicated matters further because his familiarity with police procedure allowed him to navigate the interaction in ways that minimized oversight while maintaining technical compliance. Ida Larkspur logged the call as service provided with no arrest, but she noted Rook's request that any future calls from that address should be flagged for immediate supervisor notification. The dispatcher understood that creating systems to track patterns was often the only way to identify chronic domestic violence that victims were too frightened to report clearly. Days after the call, Rook initiated background research into Ashdown's history, looking for patterns that might indicate ongoing problems. The investigation revealed that Ashdown had been married twice previously, and that both prior marriages had ended in divorces that included restraining orders filed by ex-wives who alleged physical and emotional abuse. Neither case had resulted in criminal charges, but the protection orders documented detailed accounts of violence, intimidation, and control. The current wife appeared to be unaware of this history. The information about prior restraining orders provided Rook with foundation for increased monitoring, though it didn't create immediate legal authority to intervene without new evidence. The sheriff shared the background information with neighboring agencies, ensuring that other jurisdictions would be aware of Ashdown's history. Weeks passed without additional calls from the residents, and Rook began to wonder whether the initial domestic disturbance call had been an isolated incident or whether the wife had simply learned not to seek help. Rook's concern deepened when routine checks revealed that Ashdown had purchased firearms through licensed dealers in the months since moving to the mountain property. The combination of isolation, domestic conflict, law enforcement background, and armed household created conditions that responding deputies would find extremely dangerous. Rook updated the address notes in the dispatch system to ensure that any responders would have full awareness before approaching the location. The second call from Ashdown's residence came during a storm system even more severe than the first. Ida Larkspur patched through the call with notation that it had come from the wife's cell phone, but that the caller had disconnected immediately after providing the address. The disconnection could be weather-related signal loss, but it could also indicate that the caller had been interrupted. Rook activated emergency response protocols that sent multiple units toward the mountain location. The response was complicated by road conditions that had deteriorated to the point where even chained vehicles struggled to maintain traction. Fenwick led the convoy of responding units, using his familiarity with the route to identify the safest approach path. The drive stretched to nearly 3 hours as deputies navigated roads that were barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest. The delay was excruciating for Rook, who understood that every minute increased the danger to whoever had called for help. The scene that awaited responding deputies was silent and dark, snow falling heavily enough to muffle sound and obscure visibility. Both vehicles were still parked near the house, buried under fresh accumulation. No lights were visible in any windows, and there was no response when deputies announced their presence. Rook made the decision to force entry based on the emergency call and the lack of response. The interior of the house was cold. Heat had been off long enough that temperature had dropped close to freezing. Deputies cleared rooms systematically, finding evidence of recent occupancy, but no people present. The wife's purse and identification were on a kitchen counter, suggesting she hadn't left voluntarily, and her phone was discovered in a bedroom with battery dead. Ashdown's weapons were locked in a gun safe, but several spaces in the foam padding suggested that firearms were missing. The search expanded to outbuildings and surrounding forest, deputies using thermal imaging to scan for heat signatures. The snow and wind made the search extremely difficult. Tracks obscured within minutes and visibility limited. Hours of searching produced no sign of either Ashdown or his wife. No evidence of where they might have gone, or whether they'd left together or separately. Rook established command post in the house and began coordinating expanded search operations while also initiating investigation into whether Ashdown might have fled the area entirely. Financial records checks showed no recent large withdrawals, and contacts with neighboring jurisdictions produced no reports of anyone matching Ashdown's description. The disappearance was complete and unexplained. Days of searching failed to locate either person, and the investigation shifted toward treating the disappearance as potential homicide despite lack of crime scene evidence. Rook theorized that Ashdown had killed his wife after she called for emergency assistance, then fled into the wilderness. The theory was supported by Ashdown's law enforcement background, which would give him skills for evading capture, but it remained speculation without physical evidence. The case generated media attention that brought pressure for answers. Family members of Ashdown's wife demanding information and insisting that law enforcement had failed to protect her. Rook accepted the criticism while defending the limited authority that had constrained his response to the initial call, trying to explain how legal standards created situations where law enforcement couldn't intervene preemptively, even when officers suspected abuse was occurring. Months after the disappearance, hikers discovered human remains in a ravine several miles from Ashdown's residence, decomposition and animal activity making identification difficult. DNA testing eventually confirmed the remains belonged to the missing wife, providing family with certainty while generating new questions about what had happened. The location suggested the wife had either been killed there or had been moved to that location after death, but weather and time had destroyed most physical evidence. The search for Ashdown continued as active investigation, with agencies throughout the region alerted to watch for someone matching his description. Theories ranged from successful escape to new jurisdiction, to suicide in remote location, to accidental death during flight through winter wilderness. Without resolution, the case remained open, and Rook remained haunted by questions about what he might have done differently during that first call. The mountain house stood empty through seasons following the disappearance. No new owners willing to purchase property where violence had occurred. Rook drove past the location occasionally during patrols, seeing it deteriorate as weather damage accumulated. The house became a physical reminder of how domestic violence could culminate in murder, despite warning signs and despite law enforcement presence that proved insufficient to protect victims who couldn't ask for help in ways that would trigger intervention. Years passed without resolution of Ashdown's disappearance, the case gradually moving from active investigation to cold case status as leads were exhausted. Rook reviewed the file periodically, still troubled by the initial call and the wife's careful denials that had prevented more aggressive intervention. The sheriff had learned that some cases would never reach satisfying conclusions, that some perpetrators would escape justice through death or flight, and that some victims would be lost despite law enforcement's best efforts to protect them from violence that occurred in private spaces where authority to intervene was limited until tragedy had already occurred.